Hey everyone, welcome to part 7 of my review of Patrick Hoban's book, Road of the King. This is going to be the last part of my review. I decided to take the two sections at the end and sort of combine them into one. His last real chapter is called Metagaming, and then after that he has a conclusion which is pretty short, so I figured we could just stick those together. So, as far as the metagaming chapter, it's actually pretty good. Like, I don't have a lot of criticisms. Overall, I'd say it's the least flawed. Not that I have no issues with it, and not that like, oh, if I had written it, I would have done it exactly the same way. But overall, there's not a lot to complain about. There's not like a lot of stuff that he left out. I mean, when he talks about like metagames, I think he maybe could have explored looking at how to tackle some more diverse metagames. Like he talks a lot about one deck, two deck, and three deck formats, and I guess maybe it would have been nice if he has said, okay, well, what do we do with like an eight deck format or something? I think the reason that he chose not to do so is that sort of in the Patrick Hoban era of I don't know, I guess 2013 to 2016, the metagames are just not very diverse, but in Yu-Gi-Oh, that hasn't necessarily always been the case, such as in April 2010, aka Edison format. I mean, that was like a million deck format. Um, so I guess all I'm trying to say is maybe he could have covered that a bit because we could just go out on a limb and assume that, oh, maybe Konami will just design really non-diverse formats in the future. But although that is the rule, I don't think that'll necessarily always be the case. But otherwise, like it's a pretty good section. I can see why he put the section last in the book because I think it's the one that is the most aimed at high level players, like even players who are like at a far greater level than I am in some parts. Um, like part of what he talks about in this section is format planning, which is really only relevant to Yu-Gi-Oh's top like 0.01%, like people who are like top 20 in the world, about like how to like strategically like hide text so that way like the whole world doesn't know about it because they're presumably like watching you every second, which is something that I never had to worry about, of course, because I suck. Who cares what cards I play? um but I obviously like it's something that just the vast majority of his readers like should just completely ignore for now because they won't be using it for years off until they become way better than they are. But at the same time, I don't think that that means that, oh, he just should have not put it in the book since it doesn't apply to most people. Um i i think it's like kind of interesting that like part about format planning and just like strategically playing less than optimal decks so that way you won't give away the optimal deck at like the first event. It's interesting to think about. It's not even that I necessarily agree with everything that he's saying, but it's something that I think no other book like even discusses. And I think Yu-Gi-Oh is like a little different. You can like hide things more, knowing that you're just so much better than everyone else that if you hide it, no one else will ever catch on. Whereas for like the Magic Pro Tour, I don't really think that's a viable strategy, which is why they never really do it. Um, but yeah, it's interesting. He did like in one part he said something like, "Oh, I had like two YCSs that like I knew I was going to win like before I even entered them or something." And he like sort of uses that as an example of his format planning, which I think that is saying things like that, like I knew which 1,000 person event I was going to get first at before it happened, is kind of ridiculous, like even for someone of his caliber. Just to um put things in perspective, you would need a 90% matchup against the field in order to give you more than a 50% chance of winning the YCS. So even if your odds of winning a single match were 90%, which is just absurd, you would still only have, a 53% chance of topping. If you wanted to give yourself like a 75%, or sorry, if you want, I said 50% chance of topping, but I meant 50% chance of winning. If you wanted to give yourself a 75% chance of winning a YCS, you would need to have a 95% matchup against like the entire field. So I mean, I think that was statistically a bit ridiculous, where he said like, oh, I mean, I'll try to find the part where he says it. This is like kind of a long section, and he just sort of like talks about it just like randomly. It's not like a huge focus of the book, but I felt like that line where he said, how like he knew he was going to win like a couple of two specific tournaments, I think is well, let me put it this way, Patrick Hoban. If you ever think if you ever know that you are going to get first at a YCS again, I will be happy to put money on it. Because not because that I think that like you suck or something. I mean, I think at any tournament that you go to, you're probably one of the best, if not the best players in the room. But even so, it is just very hard to know that you'll ever win a tournament. So if you ever, find yourself going to a YCS and you're like, oh, I know I'm going to win this YCS. Well, in that case, I'll be happy to put $100 on it. That way, when you win, you can get an extra $100. But the only other, the only major gripe I have, like the thing about like saying that, oh, he knew he was going to win a tournament. Yeah, I disagree, but who cares really? It doesn't really affect the actual content of the book. And like the metagaming thing where he talks about like only what I would consider to be very non-diverse metagames. Again, that, it might lead us to some scenario like 4 years from now where you're like, oh, there's like 7 good decks and Hoban's book doesn't help me. But, 90% of the time or whatever, what he's saying is true. So the only like major gripe that I have is he kind of, he emphasizes like surviving the Swiss and not like metagaming too much, because like, oh, if I prepare specifically for like this one deck in the early rounds, I might not play against it, and then like I won't be able to survive the early rounds. This mentality is like in general from like a mathematical standpoint, kind of a trap, and sometimes like it's actually the opposite, that you want to play a deck that'll either be polarized in the top of the brackets or the bottom, as opposed to having a deck that'll be in the middle a lot, because that way you sort of give yourself like a 50-50 chance to top, whereas if you're just kind of clustered in the middle, you need to get like a bit more lucky, so to speak, which is sort of like what my whole like average prize model thing is about, which I will link to in the description again. But this idea of like surviving the Swiss is generally flawed. If your deck is like, they're basically, in other words, they're either decks that are good in the metagame or bad in the metagame. And like he kind of like uses this section to sort of talk about that counters are overrated, which like I mostly agree with, just that it's not for the reason that he thinks it is. I think it's mostly just that counters to really good decks in Yu-Gi-Oh tend to not win as much as people think they do. Like as a good example, and this is like the only one that I really have, because this frankly doesn't come up a whole lot. That like in Teleded format, like the E-Hero deck with like Aliases and Thunder King Ryos and like Honest, that was like metagame to like beat Teledad, but from my experience, like it didn't even really beat Teledad. Like against a good Teledad player, the matchup was probably like 50-50, and then versus like a a slightly less than good Teledad player, the matchup was maybe like 60-40 in favor of Heroes. So like that was why like the counters are bad. It wasn't that like, oh, E-Heroes like couldn't survive the Swiss. It was that they just actually weren't as good at beating Teledad as people thought. And although I didn't play the format too much in any major capacity, I suspect it was like kind of the same thing with like Evil Swarm and Dragon Rulers. It's not that like Evil Swarms were a bad choice because they could crush Dragon Rulers but couldn't beat anything else. It's that I don't think the Evil Swarm versus Dragon Ruler matchup like is as good as a lot of Evil Swarm players thought it was. Like I don't think it was like 80-20 or something. And if it was, I do think playing Evil Swarm specifically to get polarized into the top of the brackets or the bottom of the brackets would have been a good idea. Um, there certainly are some times where metagaming for counters has been good. Um, but I think it's more of a question of how good the counters are. And so the focus should be like more on that and not so much this sort of idea of surviving the Swiss, which from a like mathematical perspective like doesn't make sense. Like it doesn't really hold up. And that's like kind of sort of like what my part of the point of like talking about this average prize model thing focused on. Um, so I don't know. I mean, obviously, like Hobins and our perspectives are a lot different. So I don't want to like try to like emphasize our differences too much. Overall, this section on metagaming is really good. It's good for weak players. It's good for average players, and it's good for above average players, which is pretty hard to do. It's pretty hard to write on a subject that is just so broadly like valuable, and he actually manages to do so. So overall, like from like an accuracy perspective and like sort of an organizational standpoint, I think this is the best chapter in the book. They're just like the things that like I'm talking about are like pretty minor points compared to like all of the things that he gets right. Um, in terms of talking about like what makes formats like develop the way that they do. Like he does sort of talk about how these formats don't always develop in logical ways because just average players obviously make up the bulk of the player base, and thus it causes metagames to develop in a way such that it's not always necessarily like consistent with the theory, I guess. Like in other words, if a deck is like just game theory optimal, it doesn't mean that average players will be able to recognize that, and that deck will end up shaping the meta, which is good. I mean, I actually like this chapter is quite good. So, moving on to the conclusion part. Uh, as you would guess, it's a conclusion, so it's pretty short and pretty insignificant. He basically just thanks everyone who helps him with the book, and he has an appendix and a glossary at the end, which is pretty nice. It's good for like reference. Like it's good that like if you're like sitting down like testing with your friends or like building a deck or you're in a tournament, I think being able to sort of like flip to the cheat sheet at the end is pretty helpful. So I'm glad that he put that in there, even though some of the things on the cheat sheet I might not necessarily agree with. It's good to have it there nonetheless. um so to wrap things up, I'm I'm guessing that a lot of people are going to want me to sort of give some sort of like rating of this book, or say like is it good or bad, or whatever. Um the thing is, it's impossible to give it like a rating like a 7 out of 10 or something, because like evaluating cards, it's all relative. And from this, from the same point of view, evaluating books is all relative too. And as of now, this is the only real book that's been written on Yu-Gi-Oh, and thus I can't like compare it to another book because there's nothing to compare it to. So I can't really give it any kind of rating. Uh, I do think that I don't know. I don't know how to say this, but some of like the theory and organization is a bit off, and I know that like a lot of the theory and organization is based off of like getting advice from Johnny Lee and not so much Hoban himself. And um, to anyone that's posted on Duelist Grounds knows, Johnny Lee is not the best person to go to for theory and providing logically tight arguments. He's good at making it sound like he knows what he's talking about, but oftentimes doesn't. And I think it would have been interesting to see how this book would have looked if Hoban sort of like focused solely on trying to put his thoughts onto paper rather than looking to less accomplished players for a way to put it into like some sort of theory per se. I'm I'm expressing myself really badly, to be honest. Like what I'm saying is nothing like what I'm actually trying to say. So yeah, he has some like good stuff in here for sure. Um, for 20, I think like right now the book is like $23 on Amazon. It's hard to say. Like obviously, as people point out, if you're like a hardcore player who's like, spending lots of money on like hotels and decks or whatever, buying this book is like a drop in the bucket, so you should like probably buy it. And if you're, a weak player who's trying to get better, this book is a pretty good guide. It's not like the end all be all, but it's a pretty good guide, and thus they should buy it too. I will say, for me specifically, and I know most people are not like me, for me, I don't think the book is worth the money in the sense that I personally did not learn very much that was new from this book. In other words, reading this book, I don't think after reading it, if I were to play in any more Yu-Gi-Oh events, which I don't plan on doing so, but I don't think that my chances of doing well at an event were improved per se. But that's for me specifically. I don't think that's necessarily the case for everyone else. So I don't want to say that, oh, like, if you're roughly as good as I am, that means that, like, you shouldn't read this book, because I don't think that's not true. For me, like, a lot of the, like, theoretical stuff, I didn't really need to know because, like, I already knew to an extent. So I don't know. Again, I'm kind of having a difficult time saying what I'm trying to say. Overall, let's, get to the point. I think Hoban did the best job that he could. And, but I also think that, releasing a second edition would be worthwhile, because perhaps he doesn't go and listen to all of my criticisms, but some of the criticisms I think are worthwhile, and I think could be changed. And maybe Hoban thinks that my criticisms are a load of bull, but I'm sure even after like reading his own book, maybe he goes back like a couple years later and thinks, huh, you know what? My perspective on this particular issue has like changed a bit, and maybe I want to like rephrase this, and maybe I want to emphasize these things more and these other things less. So it's a good book, but I don't think it's so good that he shouldn't release a second edition. If that makes sense. That's kind of like my overall viewpoint. And I think for the majority of players, it's probably worth buying. But at the same time, if you buy the book, you should like there are certain parts that are more important than others. So so yeah, hopefully that like kind of sums up my thoughts. I should probably clarify my thoughts on the book a bit better, and perhaps in a different state of mind, I'll be able to sort of state my thoughts better, which I will on Duelist Grounds because um I know that we'll be discussing this book on Duelist Grounds, and I'll link you guys to the thread where we discuss this. Um, so overall, like I know if you like go back and watch my videos, like I have a lot of things to say where this theory doesn't really hold up. This should have been emphasized more. This should have been emphasized less. Oh, this is a bunch of definitions, whatever. Um, but to average players, and obviously like Hoban and I both know that like in reality the average player is pretty bad. So for them, like this book is really good. For like these slightly above average players, and maybe even like players that are like roughly around my level, just being able to um sort of like look into Hoban's mind and just see the way that he thinks about the game. Even if you don't necessarily agree, I think it's good. Like it's good to like I say that okay, after I read this book, I don't think my chances of topping an event were increased at all. But that doesn't mean that the book wasn't worth reading. Um I don't know if like that makes sense. But to me like I like seeing how other people think even though I might not necessarily agree, which is like the same reason that like I read all these different like poker books, some that are like 10 years old and like completely outdated, is because I enjoy seeing the way that people think. And it gives you sort of a more complete perspective on the game that you're trying to play. So, even if, and that's why like I talk to like a lot of bad players about how they think about the game, as far as like Yu-Gi-Oh goes, is because I like to put myself in someone else's brain. So obviously I'm not saying that um buy Hoban's book because it's valuable just because you get to like learn Hoban's opinion even if it doesn't help you. What I'm trying to say rather is that for the average players, it will help you improve substantially. For the players closer to my level, it won't help you improve substantially, but it might give you like a few small edges that like get you from um mediocre results to like those maybe slightly better results, and thus like it's still worth your $20. Um, so yeah, hopefully that sums it up. I know it's I overall my man, I'm about to sneeze. Well, maybe not. Oh, okay, maybe I am. So, anyways, overall, like my feelings are mixed, and there's like a lot of the stuff that I think is kind of flawed or shouldn't be included, but at the same time, like he doesn't like say too many things that are just straight up wrong and will just lead you down like the wrong path either. So, when you sort of like take it as a whole, I think it's pretty good. But at the same time, I think if Hoban were to sort of go back, sit down, think about this a bit more, try to outline everything a bit more logically, and emphasize the things that are like just really important, and maybe do this like 3 years from now, let's say. I think he could write a second edition that would like blow this one out of the water. So yeah, this is it. Hopefully you guys enjoyed my reviews, and much in the same way that this book is sort of an insight to the way that Hoban thinks about the game. Hopefully these reviews were an insight to the way that I think about the game. I will say, just to wrap things up, I don't plan to write a book about Yu-Gi-Oh, because like people like for whatever reason they do ask me that, and I will say that it would be very difficult to make a book that is successful as this one, both from a sort of number of buyers standpoint, but also from like a a theoretical, like, 400 pages of Yu-Gi-Oh that makes sense kind of a thing. So point is that I don't plan to do this. One, because I suck. Two, because it takes a lot of time, and three, because no one would buy it. So in other words, um, this kind of thing, people do need to appreciate it, even if it is flawed at points, because this is the only book that we're gonna get, guys. I think. I mean, I don't think Billy Brake is going to sit down and start writing his book anytime soon. If he was gonna do that, I think he would have done it by now, and I don't think he's going to do it specifically to like try to outdo Hoban either. I just think he probably doesn't give a shit, and he has better things to do than to write a book. So I do want to say thank you, Hoban, for writing the book. Hopefully you didn't take my criticisms too hard. And I actually do hope that you take some of my criticisms to heart and write a second edition in the future.